Brett and May by Cameron Rogowski. Brett and May was written in Elgin, Texas, while listening to Say It Like You Mean It by The Starting Line. Chapter 1. Brett took a deep breath as he put his hand on the front door of the old schoolhouse for the first time since summer break started back in June. The brass handle was hot against his palm after sitting in the central Texas sun for just an hour. In the Texas summer, the sun baked everything in its rays from the time it peeked over the horizon until it set in the evening. A hot door handle wasn't enough to deter him from kicking off the senior year of high school. Although he was now in his last year of mandatory formal education, his routine was going to be pretty much the same as it had been for the last 11 school years. St. Farr only had one schoolhouse, one class schedule, and currently one teacher. Even though he was going to be spending most of his day sitting in a class with the same neighbors and classmates that he'd had since elementary school, he was determined to make it the most of his senior year. Brett realized he'd been sitting in front of the closed door, grasping its handle longer than any sane person should. He shook his head, as if he could clear his mind with enough rustling, then opened the door. Immediately, the familiar drone of nearly every kid in town filled his ears. Voices of all ages, kindergartners, prepubescent kids, preteens, and those on the edge of adulthood, all mixed together in a familiar chorus. It was just like he remembered it. The ancient school teacher, Miss Melton, gave Brett a genuine smile and an excited wave as he walked into the entryway. The school was small and showing its wear after all these years, just like the rest of St. Farr. Miss Melton was showing a bit of wear herself, but she looked great for being the oldest thing in the building. She had been teaching the children of St. Farr for so long, the entire town assumed one day the schoolhouse would collapse around her. It would be the only way she would get a fitting burial. Brett laughed at the thought of Miss Melton's final resting place consisting of a gigantic pile of red bricks, a single chalkboard sticking out of the heap straight in the air, so the town could write, "Here lies Miss Melton, everyone's favorite teacher," on the makeshift headstone. In all honesty, Brett was convinced that Miss Melton was going to outlive him, and he wasn't even at an age where he'd become preoccupied with death yet. After waving back to Miss Melton, Brett turned right into the first classroom, the high school room. St. Farr was a tiny community roughly 2 hours south of Austin, Texas. The schoolhouse had been built back in the 1920s when the town was at peak population. At the time, they had created the tiny two-story building with the thought that St. Farr would continue to grow. They put 6 classrooms on the ground floor and 6 more upstairs in hopes that they would soon be full of children. The population stagnated shortly after, then began to decline, turning that hope of 12 full classes into an inside joke all the locals repeated at every community event. St. Farr small talk consisted mostly of weather, wondering how Miss Melton was still walking around, and how funny it was that the previous generation's optimists thought the town was going to grow into some kind of metropolis one day. Not only did they never fill the 12 classrooms at the school, they had only been using 3 of those classrooms to educate the entire town of St. Farr for a couple decades now. One classroom for the young elementary kids, one for the uncertain middle schoolers, and one for the high schoolers. Somehow, Miss Melton managed to teach all 3 classes by herself each day. She truly was a big part of what kept the town from descending into complete stupidity. As Brett stepped through the open doorway into the high school classroom and instinctively held his hand up as if he was shielding his eyes from the sun's rays, the pink walls were bright. Every year he'd forgotten how bright and irritating they were. Brett was happy to live in St. Farr, and he was firmly planted on the Ferris side of the old flamingo argument. Ferris was a flamingo that had mistakenly come to St. Farr back in 1912. No one knew why. One day, Bucky Jones, the youngest of the Jones boys, started spreading the rumor that he had seen a funny bird at St. Farr Lake. Bucky and his friends returned to the lake to confirm that, indeed, a single flamingo had decided to rest its tired wings on the shore of the old man-made lake outside the tiny town. Soon, all the citizens of St. Farr were making their way out to the lake to sit and observe the beautiful tall bird. Ferris built a nest, ate local fish, and sat still, just letting the time pass. It reminded the townsfolk of themselves, making small improvements when they can, while time slowly passes them in central Texas. After a few weeks, Ferris was shot by Borland Young when he was duck hunting. The town never forgave him. As a result of this tragedy, St. Farr now sported sculptures, paintings, and tributes to Ferris the flamingo, the unofficial symbol of St. Farr. In that grand tradition, the school took the flamingo as their official mascot and, in an act of school and community pride, had painted the entire classroom bright pink. Brett's eyes were starting to adjust to the irritating hue, and he lowered his hand from his face just in time to see his friends Jacob, Adam, and Alex approaching. He began walking quickly towards them, clasping hands and giving a small hug to each boy in the group, one after the other. Even though they saw each other every day at soccer practice and hung out nearly every evening, it was still exciting to see the gang in the flesh in a fresh setting. "Did you hear Savage Garden on your way in this morning?" Alex asked Brett in an exasperated look. "Truly, madly, deeply," Brett replied. "One of my favorites." The boys had a good portion of the boys and a good portion of St. Farr remarked on the music that they had heard often. "It's because of KOBO, the local radio station, local in the St. Farr town square." KOBO was the only radio signal that radios in St. Farr could pick up reliably, so it was available nearly everywhere in town. Most of the shops had it playing in the background to chase away the silence of the small town. Many citizens had radio dials in their vehicles permanently tuned to KOBO frequency, and the town square even had a series of small speakers lining the top of the old brick buildings that would quietly play KOBO for each soul walking in the streets. The radio station was run by a lady named Pat. She had been the one who had founded the station using a federal grant several years ago. Now, Pat would broadcast a live show from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day. Outside of those hours, Pat would let the playlist run. The playlist was a carefully curated list of Pat's favorite hit songs from the 90s and 2000s that she kept on her iPod. At precisely 5 p.m., Pat would sign off for the day and start the never-changing playlist, meaning the same songs played at the same times every evening, throughout the night and into the morning. At the final second of 8:59 a.m., the playlist would conclude and Pat would, once again, fill the airwaves with her live show. "Truly, Madly, Deeply" may not have actually been one of Brett's favorite songs, but he was going to need to learn to enjoy it. He was going to be hearing it on his walk to school every morning until he graduated. "Excuse me." Brett felt a tap on his shoulder and heard a soft voice timidly ask for his attention. The other boys went silent, staring at the source. Brett turned around and saw a beautiful girl. The girl had long blonde hair with lengthy bangs brushed to the side and held in place with a purple clip. Her yellow shirt was nearly as bright as the pink wall behind her. She looked kind, but a little nervous to be approaching him. He didn't recognize her. Maybe she was new in town and looking for a friend. "Yeah?" Brett replied, trying to keep his mind from being curious about what she wanted. He needed to focus on the incoming conversation. "Are you Brett?" That was kind of an odd question. Brett had assumed the girl was going to introduce herself or start telling him about whatever tiny school club she had started so that she could find additional members. "Yeah, what's up?" "It's me, May." The girl couldn't hide her excitement. A smile had spread across her face, raising both her cheeks high enough to partially cover her hazel eyes. Brett started to panic. May? Who was May? The name didn't ring a bell. He didn't recognize her face. He wasn't sure what to do next. The anxiety must have made its way to his face, and May's smile began to fade. "Do you remember me?" Okay, now Brett really had to think this through. May. His brain couldn't fail him now. A pretty girl had approached him on the first day of school, of what was undoubtedly going to be the best school year of his life. It would have been off to a fantastic start if he could just work out this surprise puzzle. "Oh, May!" The synapses finally decided to fire. Of course he remembered May. The girl nodded. She smiled, returning to her, the smile returned to her face. Brett couldn't contain his excitement. He reached out and gave her a big hug. It wasn't enough. He lifted her off the ground, holding her close, their chests pressed against one another, and he spun her around like he had seen in Sleeping Beauty when he was a child. Fittingly, in that moment, May felt like a princess.